A 9-year-old girl brings home a math test, 25 problems, 23 correct answers, her work shown in full detail, every step, every calculation. Her grade, 50%, not because the answers were wrong, not because she cheated, because she used the wrong method. And when her father pushed back, the school doubled down, threatening a 0 if it happened again. Here's how one parent's refusal to accept that decision exposed a fault line running through American education. Here's the full story. To understand what happened here, you need to understand the world this 9-year-old was navigating. We'll call her Emma. Her name and school have been changed to protect her privacy. Emma is a 4th grader at a public elementary school, and for most of this academic year, mathematics has been a genuine struggle. Not because she isn't capable, but because the method her school uses to teach multiplication and division simply isn't connecting with how her brain processes information. And in American education today, that disconnect has a specific name and a complicated political history. Emma's school, like thousands of public schools across the country, teaches using what educators call Common Core-aligned mathematics, a curriculum built to develop something called number sense, not just calculation ability. In practice, this means students don't simply stack numbers and multiply the way most adults over 30 were taught. They decompose numbers into parts, draw visual grids called area models, multiply each part separately, and then add everything back together. The educational theory behind this is legitimate and well-researched. But for Emma, it wasn't working. She was getting problems wrong approximately 80% of the time, every single week, all year. Her family had exhausted every official option the school offered: tutoring sessions, nightly homework reviews, parent-teacher conferences. None of it changed the trajectory, so Emma's father, we'll call him David, did what parents have done for generations when the system stops working for their child. He sat down at the kitchen table and taught her the way he learned it, the traditional multiplication algorithm. Stack the numbers, multiply digit by digit, carry the remainder, add the columns, straightforward and direct. For Emma, it was the difference between confusion and clarity. Her homework went from a nightly struggle to something she could do on her own. From David's perspective, the logic was simple. His daughter was failing to learn math the school's way. 80% wrong is not a rounding error. That is a method mismatch. He taught her a mathematically valid alternative that is used in classrooms and households across the world. Her performance improved. Her confidence grew. He wasn't working against the curriculum or undermining the teacher. He was filling a gap the curriculum had left open. That seemed to him like exactly what a parent is supposed to do. But before we reduce Emma's teacher to the villain in this story, we need to be honest about what she was seeing from her side of the classroom. Teachers who enforce Common Core methods aren't doing it out of stubbornness or ego. They're trained to evaluate conceptual understanding, not simply whether a student reached the correct answer. When Emma's teacher saw a different algorithm on her test, she didn't see a clever student using a valid shortcut. She saw a student who may not have internalized the conceptual framework at all, and who might struggle badly when that framework becomes essential in algebra, in geometry, in any math that builds on number sense rather than rote calculation. Her concern was not unreasonable. Then came the test that set everything in motion: 25 multiplication problems. Emma worked through them using the traditional algorithm her father had taught her. She showed every step, clean, organized, traceable. She got 23 out of 25 correct. That's a 92% by any standard calculation. She came home and handed her parents a test with a 50 written in red across the top. The instructions on that test said, in explicit terms, show your work, not show the classroom method, not use the area model. Show your work. Emma had. Her work just didn't look like what the teacher expected to see. David contacted the teacher. His argument was direct. The test instructions said show your work with no mention of a required method. Emma followed the stated instructions exactly, deducting 42 percentage points for method noncompliance, when that standard was never communicated to students before the test, wasn't fair assessment. It was retroactive rule enforcement. The teacher's position held. Emma needed to use the method demonstrated in class, and then she added the sentence that changed the entire temperature of this situation. Next time, she said, it would be a 0. Before we go any further, I want to ask you something directly. Your child solves 23 out of 25 problems correctly, shows every step of her work, comes home with a 50%, and the school threatens a 0 if she does it again. Where do you land on that? Think carefully, because the answer isn't as obvious as it might feel in the first 30 seconds. Your response says something real about how you weigh parental authority against institutional trust. And that tension is at the center of every case like this one. Here is the legal and institutional framework that governs exactly this kind of dispute, because it matters more than most parents realize until they are already in the middle of it. Public school students in the United States are protected by a layered web of federal and state law. Under the Every Student Succeeds Act, the primary federal statute governing K through 12 education, parents have an explicit right to be meaningfully informed about their child's academic progress, the right to request formal meetings, and the right to challenge school decisions through established administrative channels. Beyond federal law, most states have passed what are commonly called parental rights in education statutes, legislation positioning parents as active participants in their child's schooling, not passive recipients of whatever a district chooses to enforce. Under these frameworks, individual grading decisions are generally within a teacher's professional discretion. But that discretion is not unlimited. Courts and school boards have consistently held that grading practices must not be arbitrary or punitive. They must connect to a legitimate, articulable educational purpose. Reducing a 92% to a 50 for using an alternative correct method, when the test itself never specified a required algorithm, sits uncomfortably close to that boundary. Courts have historically been reluctant to second-guess individual classroom decisions, and appropriately so. Judicial micromanagement of every grading call would be unworkable. But courts have intervened when grading practices appear designed to punish rather than assess, and when those practices are unsupported by written policy. The threat of a 0 for correct work, without any test language requiring a specific method, without any prior written notification to students or parents, could, with the right documentation, form the basis for a formal grievance that travels well beyond the principal's office. David didn't know this going in, but he acted in a way that would have held up if it had gone further. David went to the principal, and the way he did it matters. He didn't go in angry. He didn't go in making accusations. He went in with the test in hand, the instructions highlighted, and a single clear argument. The test said, "Show your work." Emma showed her work, and 42 points were removed for a standard that was never communicated to students before the assessment began. The principal reviewed the test. The teacher was called into the meeting. In that room, under the pressure of the documented facts, the school's position shifted. The principal sided with David. Emma's grade was corrected to the 92% it should have been. Going forward, students in that class could use any mathematically valid method as long as they showed their work. It was the right institutional outcome, clean and unambiguous, but the teacher left that meeting visibly unhappy. And David's wife, watching from outside the process, had been warning him from the beginning that winning this particular argument might cost Emma something harder to measure than a letter grade. David's wife was not arguing that the original grade was fair. She agreed it wasn't. Her concern was different and more layered. David had just forced a public reversal of a teacher's professional judgment under administrative pressure. Emma still had months left in that classroom, and teachers carry informal power that is nearly impossible to document: a slightly lower effort grade, less encouragement during a difficult lesson, subtly discouraging feedback on borderline answers. None of that shows up on a formal report. None of it can be appealed. The teacher's resentment, however unprofessional, was real, and real resentment is very hard to fight. This is the tension that sits at the center of parent-school disputes, and it is rarely acknowledged honestly. Institutional channels exist. They can produce correct outcomes, but institutions are made of people, and people remember. David was factually right. He used appropriate channels. He got the accurate result. Whether he created a different, quieter problem for his daughter in the process, something that doesn't appear in a file anywhere, is the question his wife raised. It deserves to be taken seriously, because it's true. Being right and winning can have costs that show up later. So I want to ask you directly, what would you have done differently? Is there a version of this where David makes the same argument without escalating to the principal? Should he have gone further, to the district level, put it in writing, created a formal paper trail? Or does the threat of a 0 for correct work represent exactly the line that must be challenged, whatever the social cost to a 9-year-old's classroom dynamic? Drop your answer in the comments. This is the kind of case where the most valuable analysis comes from the people watching it, not just the person narrating it. The ruling was correct. Emma's 92% was restored. Students in that class were permitted to use any valid method as long as they showed their work. That is the right call, and here is the precise reason why. A test that says show your work is assessing whether a student can demonstrate mathematical reasoning, whether they understand the process, not just the answer. It is not, and cannot legitimately be, a compliance audit for one specific pedagogical method. Those are fundamentally different things, and conflating them is not education. The principal, whether or not he framed it this way,